Good to look out and see so many here. I'm glad we have people that are maybe here for the first time. We're glad you're here. You might have noticed we aren't singing very many songs. That's because we recognize that there's a pandemic still going on, and we're trying to keep our worship as briefly as we can and still worship God and still feel like we're singing and encouraging one another. And then during the sermon, we've been going through the Gospel of John. Gospel of John. John is trying to present Jesus in such a way that it will instill confidence in us to put our hope and our trust in Jesus. And he tells us right off that he's not told us everything about Jesus. He says there's a lot of things Jesus did that aren't in this book, but he's writing these things so that we might believe, that we might be able to put our trust and our hope in Jesus. Last week, what we saw is Jesus deliberately going to a garden where he had gone with his disciples many times before, a garden where Judas knew where he would be. And Judas came looking for him along with 600 soldiers, all the temple guard, and they found him and they arrested him. And we read that last week. Jesus wasn't running. He was not hiding. He goes out to meet them because he's determined to drink the cup that God has asked him to drink. And so today we're going to be in John the 18th chapter. We're going to pick up from where we left off, John the 18th chapter, beginning in verse 12. So the Roman cohort, that's the 600 soldiers that came. So the Roman cohort, the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him and brought him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now, Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was in their best interest for one man to die in behalf of the people. Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now, that disciple was known to the high priest, and he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then the slave woman, who was the doorkeeper, said to Peter, "You're not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves. And Peter was also with them, standing and worshiping and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I've spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple area, where all the Jews congregate, and I said nothing in secret. Why are you asking me? Ask those who have heard what I spoke to them. Look, these people know what I said." But when he said this, one of the officers who was standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, "Is that the way you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me?" So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was still standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You're not one of his disciples as well, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, who was related to the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. You know, one of the interesting things is at the very beginning of this passage in verse 12, it says that they bound Jesus. And then towards the end in verse 24, it again mentions that Jesus is bound. And I think it's very significant for us to recognize that, because Jesus was willing to be bound to break us free from the chains of sin that bind us, to break us free from the bonds of Satan has on us. He was willing to be bound for us. In fact, this seems to be what was pointed to in the Old Testament. In Genesis, the 22nd chapter, verse 9, you have the story of Isaac and Abraham. Remember Isaac, and God asked Abraham if he would sacrifice Isaac. And it says here, then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. He bound him. Isaac becomes a type of Christ. The only difference is that in the story of Abraham and Isaac, Isaac is set free. In the story of Jesus, Jesus goes to be sacrificed for us. In Psalm 118, in verse 27, it says, "The Lord is God, and he has given us light. Bind the festival sacrifice to the horns of the altar with cords." Bind the festival sacrifice, the Passover sacrifice, bind them to the altar. Again, pointing to what's going to happen with Jesus. And so Jesus allows him to be bound. Now, there's something else that's significant I need to mention in this story that is really interesting, because there are two significant events happening at the same time. And John uses this interesting literary device, which makes it a little bit hard on preachers sometimes, because we want to go through one topic and then take the next topic, and he's going like this to us. And so what he does is he gives us in scenes. He's telling the story in different scenes. In fact, he's a lot like a modern-day movie maker. I mean, we see this in movies and shows all the time. You're there in the one case, and then they flash to another case happening at the same time, and lets us know these are happening simultaneously. Well, John's doing the same thing. And so we have the story of Jesus and what's going on with him, but there's another story going on at the same time with Peter. And so he tells us that story, and then he flashes back to the one with Jesus. Then he flashes back to the one with Peter. And so we have these four separate scenes of these two events. Now, one of the tempting things as you're going through a series like this is to borrow from the synoptics. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the same story, but a little bit differently. And it's really tempting for me to fill in all the gaps, to give all the details by bringing them in. But I'm not going to do that. I have strived really hard during this whole series not to borrow from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, unless I absolutely felt I needed to, because what I want to do is tell you the story the way John tells you. Here's what John wants us to know. I want us to know, here's the way John told the story, and here's what he wants us to know. And so we are going to look at these four scenes, the four scenes that John wants us to look at. And so we'll look at scene 1, first of all. Here's scene 1, verses 12 through 14. Jesus is led to Annas. Now, who is Annas? Annas had been the high priest. Annas was high priest from 6 A.D. to 15 A.D. And at 15 A.D., the Roman governor, who was previous to Pilate, the Roman governor got mad at him and took him out. And then after that, the Romans weren't satisfied with any of the high priests, and they didn't want any of them to gain any kind of power that they have. And so Annas had 5 sons and a grandson, and so they became high priest after him. And then he was to his son-in-law, who's Caiaphas. So Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas, who was disposed of by the Romans as the high priest. And so he comes to Annas. And it's interesting here in verse 13, and led him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. I think that John is being a little bit tongue-in-cheek there. We don't always see it very good. He's just saying, during this this yearly rotation of priests, well, it is his lot this year. It fell on him during this revolving door of high priest. And so then he begins to mention a little bit about Caiaphas. Caiaphas had mentioned previously, and we looked at this before, he mentioned previously a prophecy that was really coming from the selfishness of Caiaphas, but became really a prophetic statement. Back in chapter 11 of John, verses 47 through 50, if we move on to that text. There we are. Therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council meeting, and they were saying, "What are we doing in regard to the fact that this man is performing many signs? If we let him go on like this, all the people will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take over both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor are you taking into account that it is in your best interest that one man die for the people and that the whole nation not perish instead." Now, he did not say this on his own, but as he was high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation. And it's really interesting because in Caiaphas' mind, what he's thinking is one of us has got to go. It's either him or us. So it's better that he die than the rest of us take the consequences for his actions. But on the other side, John is letting us know that really he's talking prophetically. He doesn't even know he's doing this. He's speaking of the fact that Jesus was going to die for the nation and for all people. Now, when you go down to chapter 11, when you get to verse 53, their intentions are very clear. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Jesus has got to go. And so John's reminding us of this previous thing that happened with Caiaphas. They bring him to Annas. He's the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who prophesied and who said, one of us has got to go. It's got to be him. And so they were trying to bring charges against Jesus in some way that they could put him to death. They had determined to kill him. Now, Annas, get back to Annas for just a moment. Annas was in control of this lucrative temple business that was going on. And Jesus was threatening that business. Twice already he had hindered their cash flow by kicking everybody out. He'd already done that twice, and he does not like Jesus because he's threatening them. Now, Annas is extremely rich. He is ruthless. He is ambitious. He is greedy, and he's afraid to lose his power. And so that's the first scene that John's setting up for us. Look, he's taken to Annas. This is Caiaphas' father-in-law. He does not like Jesus. He wants him dead. Scene 2. Scene 2 here, verses 15 through 18, is about Peter. Peter follows Jesus to Caiaphas' or to Annas' house. And there's another disciple, text mentions. Now, this is no doubt John, because this is the way John does it. John will say, and the disciple Jesus loved. Well, it's clear it was him. And when they were running to the tomb, it was the other disciple that got there first, John 23. And we find out from the synoptics it was John. And so we know that John is talking about himself. And so John is there, and John, he goes right into the door because he knows the high priest. Isn't that interesting? Now, I don't have time to go into all this, but there's a likely chance that John is related to the high priest in some way. And I would go through all that, but it's not significant. If it was a significant thing, John would have told us this. But he just says, I knew the high priest, so I went in there, and John is known to them. And then he realizes that Peter's been left outside the gate. So he goes and talks to the servant girl in charge of the gate and says, I know this guy, let him in. So they let him in. And then apparently John goes off, and Peter's just standing there wondering what he should do next. And this little girl, this slave girl, and that's what she is, a slave girl, she's the lowliest of the low. She's no one anybody to fear at all. All her job is to stand there and open the gate. She's just a gate opener. You know, we have automatic doors now. That's what her job was. She sees somebody come, she opens the door. And when they go in, she closes the door. That's it. And she says to Peter, oh, you're one of his disciples, aren't you? I am not. Now, this is going to be quite a contrast, because what does Jesus say when they ask him who he is? I am. And Peter says, I am not. He makes this denial, I am not. And then in verse 18, it tells us that there was the arresting posse. I'll put it that way. The people had gone on to arrest Jesus. They were there in the courtyard, and they were warming themselves in a charcoal fire because it was cold. And Peter joins this group of people there warming themselves by the fire. Now, I just want to mention one thing. This word for charcoal fire is only going to be mentioned one more time in the Bible, and that's going to be in John the 21st chapter, verse 9. Now, I only mention this because I want you to put a peg in your brain, or pin it in your brain somewhere, that we've talked about this charcoal fire when we get to chapter 21. It's going to become significant, but I don't want to tell you the story because I want to wait and tell you the story when we get to chapter 21. But he's here in front of this charcoal fire denying Jesus, and he's there with all these men. He joins these men. Now we come to scene 3. Scene 3, verses 19 through 24. And so the high priest was questioning Jesus. Now, this high priest we're talking about is Annas, and this confuses people because I thought Caiaphas was the high priest. Well, it's almost like in the United States, we're used to this kind of concept. If you were the president of the United States, you're always going to be referred to as the president. Bill Clinton is the president. Whoever a former president was, he's the president. We'll always call him the president. If he was here today, let me introduce you to the president of the United States. He's not in that office right now. And that's what they did with the high priest. It was such an office that title continued with you no matter what. The significant thing is it was meant to die with you. You're supposed to be in that office until you died. So here's Annas, and we have to know that he's being referred to because it doesn't make sense in verse 24 when he sends him off to Caiaphas. So a little bit of literary detail. And he questions Jesus. Tell me about your disciples and tell us about your teaching. And Jesus said, what do you mean? It's been public. I've not done anything secret. Everything I've taught has been here in the temple. It's been in the synagogues. Everybody knows what I've been teaching. And let's not forget this. Annas knows exactly what Jesus teaches. He knows exactly what Jesus believes. He's been following the actions of Jesus now for months and months. He knows that, so just don't get confused. He knows what Jesus believes, but he asked him anyway. Now, Jesus is going to bring out that Annas is acting inappropriately. He says, well, why are you asking me this? And now it's easy to get these details, to miss these details. He's asked, why did you ask me this? Because, now let me make it, in the United States, we have the Fifth Amendment. You know what the Fifth Amendment? You cannot incriminate yourself in court. You have the right not to do that. And so, did you murder this guy on this night? Well, even if you did, you don't have to admit it. Did you steal this? You don't have to admit it, because what they're supposed to do is bring the evidence. We saw you there that night. We saw you do it. Here's the evidence. Here's the witnesses. And so Jesus said, well, wait. Why are you asking me this? This is inappropriate, because Rome and the Jews had the same law that we do. Where we think we got these laws. The Fifth Amendment was first with the Romans and then was with the Jews, that they could not incriminate themselves. So what was supposed to take place here, if this was any kind of trial at all, is that they were making an indictment against Jesus, and then they're to bring witnesses in. And these witnesses, all the evidence had to be validated by at least 2 witnesses, and each witness had to be interviewed separately. That was supposed to be taking place. But what happens here in the story in scene 3 is Annas is acting like the judge, but he's also acting like the prosecuting attorney. How would you like that situation if you went to court? So here's the prosecuting attorney, and he's also the judge. I mean, you're not going to get anywhere with that. And so here he's saying, wait, this is inappropriate. You haven't brought any evidence. You haven't brought any witnesses. What's going on? And in Micah, the 5th chapter, verse 1, by the way, it says, now muster yourselves and troops, daughter of troops. They have laid siege against us. With a rod they will strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. This is the passage, by the way, that's going to talk about Jesus being born in Bethlehem. And they're going to strike the judge on the cheek. And that's what happens. Jesus, when he says, why are you asking me this? He's struck. He's struck by one of these temple policemen. And this is the first blow. And in my mind, I see somebody slapping him across the face. I don't know what you see. Maybe somebody backhanding Jesus. And what are you doing? And but the temple police carry clubs. And the Talmud mentions Annas and his band of men. The Talmud, by the way, I know there's all these big religious words. The Talmud is merely a Jewish commentary on life and the scriptures, and it mentions a lot of things, and there's about 38 books in the Talmud that talks about Jewish life and gives you commentary on various scriptures. And so in the Talmud, it says, woe to the house of Annas, woe to their serpent's hiss, they are high priest. Their sons are keepers of the treasury. Their sons-in-law are guardians of the temple. And their servants beat the people with staves. A stave is a club. It's interesting that it doesn't appear that the Jews liked Annas much either. He and his family are ripping us off. And if you don't like it, they're going to beat you. So I have to stop looking at this guy slapping Jesus across the face with his backhand and figure that he probably had a club and smashed him right there on the cheek. Just smashes him in the face with this. And Jesus doesn't retaliate. He asks him, why did you do that? And the key word in this is testify what I've done wrong. Tell me where I've done wrong. He's still looking for testimony. He's still looking for witnesses. Tell me what I have done wrong. Where's the accusation? Where's the witnesses? Where's the testimonies? Now then, this is not a trial. We always talk about, here's the trial of Jesus. This is not the trial of Jesus. Their minds were made up. They were just looking for an excuse to kill him. And so what happens is Annas sends Jesus to Caiaphas. And Caiaphas is apparently meeting with the Sanhedrin at the same time, which will come out later. So now we come to scene 4. Let's go to scene 4. Scene 4 is verses 25 through 27, and we're back to Peter again. And Peter, he's still standing there, and he's still warming himself. The old pioneer preachers used to call this sermon, Warming at the Campfire of the Devil. Warming at the devil's campfire. And they also called it God's people in the wrong place. That would be a good sermon. God's people's often been in the wrong place. God's people are wrong. Warming at the devil's campfire. And it says that he's warming himself, and all these people ask him, aren't you one of his disciples too? And he says, I am not. And then a relative of Malchus, remember Malchus is the guy who had his ear cut off there in the garden. A relative of him says, I saw you in the garden. And he says, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. Okay, it wasn't me. I didn't do it. You know, we got you on camera. It wasn't me. I saw you. It wasn't me. So not only does he deny knowing Jesus, he denied being a disciple of Jesus, he even denies even being in the garden with Jesus. And then the rooster crows. Now, some commentators say that this is probably about 3 in the morning. Now, if that's 3 in the morning, then this is an unusual thing for a rooster to crow at 3 in the morning. And maybe a miraculous thing, and it could be. The other thing it could be is it could be morning by now. It could be morning, and all of a sudden the rooster crows because he's supposed to crow because it's morning, and they've been looking at Jesus all night long. Either way, I wouldn't object to either way if you looked at it either way. And so here we have 4 scenes and 2 interweaving stories that contrast with one another. We have the questioning by the high priest, the highest authority in the land, religious authority in the land. And then we have, on the other hand, the questioning by the servants of the high priest, the lowliest of the low of Peter. I have this great contrast here. And then you have Jesus standing up to his questioners, and Peter cowering and denying everything. Peter's denials are contrasted with Jesus' faithfulness. Now, what do we learn from Peter? Don't be self-confident. Don't fall asleep when you should be praying. Don't go around with dangerous people. Don't give in to fear. I don't know. You have to remember, back in John 13, John the 13th chapter, verse 36 through 38. We'll get that text up here. It's not there? Well, you know what? It's not there. We'll have to look it up in our own Bible. And I remember, I didn't put it down. Sorry, Steve. I didn't even put it down because I was going to look it up in my own Bible, because that's the way I wanted to do it. He says, Simon Peter said to Jesus, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered, where I go, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow later. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you right now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times. And this really frustrates me. All the commentators, all the preachers, look at Peter. He was such a coward. He was such a terrible person. Wait a minute. This is the guy who says, I'll die for you. I'll always be there with you. Remember, this is the guy that just previously, just a few hours before, had pulled out his sword and was going to take on this whole cohort of the Roman army. He's the one that struck out at this man that was right there next to him. If Peter's guilty, then so are we. Now, I'm going to put my money on Peter. I like Peter. Unfortunately, Peter reminds me of me. I mean, who of us consistently expresses our faith? I mean, I always want to be that guy that says, I'm going to die for you. There's nothing that I'm not going to be able to resist. But then I know the reality sets in, and I find I'm not resisting anything I should be resisting. I'm denying him in all kinds of ways by my lifestyle, by what I say and by what I do. It's terribly frustrating. And so what is John's point? I think that John is trying to let us know that Jesus is strong and stable and sacrificial. And he's someone that we can say to him, I love you. And we can also say to him, please forgive me. Someone that we can put our hope in and our trust in. And that's what John is trying to do in this entire book. And I think he's trying to bring this out here one more time. That Jesus is willing to be bound so we can be set free. Because we can't even get out of our own way. We're just like Peter. You know, if you start criticizing Peter, realize that you're not any better than Peter. We're in the same boat. If Peter was a mess, so are we. But thankfully, like Peter, we can go and say, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And God will continue to use Peter. Peter's going to be able to speak the first sermon. He's going to be part of the foundation of the church. So many glorious things happened to Peter. And John's just trying to let us know that's the kind of Savior, that's the kind of master we serve. One who is stable. I'm sure he's not happy with Peter. He's not glad that Peter did that, but he's also understanding and forgiving. What a marvelous God we have. There's the 4 scenes. John has this interesting way of telling his story.